The house itself was nothing special. A small, one-story place with creaky floors and a few loose shutters that rattled when the wind picked up. It wasn't fancy, but it felt cozy enough. The kind of place you'd imagine in an old postcard, tucked away at the edge of a dense forest. I remember thinking, this is it. This is where I can finally get some peace and quiet. I'd always been the type who loved being up late. There's something about the world at night that feels different. Calmer, quieter, like it's waiting for something. I'd spend hours working on my writing, a cup of coffee by my side, and a playlist of soft music playing in the background. It wasn't unusual for me to sit up until the early hours, just letting the night stretch out around me. The first few days were normal, uneventful even. I unpacked my boxes, got my Wi-Fi hooked up, and even met one of the neighbors, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Grant who lived about half a mile down the road. She warned me to be careful driving at night. "The deer out here don't care much for cars," she said with a laugh. Honestly, I didn't mind the solitude. In fact, I welcomed it. After years of cramped apartments and noisy neighbors, the silence was like a gift. I spent my evenings sitting on the porch with a blanket wrapped around me, staring out at the black silhouette of the trees under a sky filled with stars. It was beautiful, almost too perfect, like one of those moments you see in a movie and wish you could live in forever. But then there was the forest. It stretched endlessly behind the house, thick with trees that seemed taller than any I'd seen before. During the day, it was almost inviting, with sunlight streaming through the leaves and the sound of birds echoing through the branches. But at night, it was different. The shadows between the trees grew darker, deeper. I'd catch myself staring out the window, feeling like something was watching me from between the trunks, though I never saw anything. One night, I decided to go for a walk before bed. The air was crisp, and the gravel crunched under my shoes as I made my way down the dirt path behind the house. The forest felt alive, almost buzzing with the sound of insects and the occasional rustle of leaves. I told myself it was just the wind. It had to be. As I walked, I started noticing how quiet it was. Too quiet. The kind of silence that makes you stop in your tracks and strain your ears for any sign of life. The trees seemed to press in closer, their shadows stretching across the path like fingers reaching for something. I shivered and turned back, quickening my pace until the house came into view again. That night, I locked every door and window before going to bed. Looking back, it's strange how normal it all seemed at first. The small creaks in the house, the way the wind howled through the trees. But there was this feeling, this subtle, nagging sense that the quiet wasn't just quiet. It was something else, something waiting. I brushed it off as my imagination, convincing myself that it was just the adjustment to a new place. Everyone feels a little uneasy when they move, right? Still, I couldn't shake the thought that maybe this wasn't just about getting used to a new house. Maybe the quiet wasn't as harmless as I'd thought. The next night, I stayed inside. I didn't plan on walking near the forest again anytime soon, not after how strange it felt. Something about it was off. I chalked it up to being new to the area, my imagination running wild, or maybe just that unsettling quiet. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Around midnight, as I sat at my desk trying to finish an article, I heard something outside. It wasn't loud, just faint enough to make me question if I'd heard it at all. A soft shuffle, like footsteps in dry leaves. My first thought was the neighbor's cat. Mrs. Grant had mentioned she had one that liked to roam. But when I peered out the window, the yard was empty. The only movement came from the tall grass swaying in the breeze. I shook my head and muttered to myself, "Get a grip. You're just spooking yourself." I went back to work, determined to ignore the tiny, nagging feeling creeping up my spine. But then it happened again. This time, it was louder, clearer, like someone dragging something across the gravel path near the back of the house. I froze. My hands hovered over the keyboard, my pulse suddenly racing. It's probably just an animal, I thought, though my gut wasn't buying it. Grabbing my phone, I used the flashlight to scan the backyard from the window. Nothing. No raccoons. No deer. No cats. Just that unsettling stillness hanging in the air. I decided to check the locks again, not because I thought anything was wrong, but because it made me feel better. The door was secure, the windows too. Still, as I double-checked each lock, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. The next morning, I found something strange near the edge of the forest. A small pile of stones had appeared overnight, carefully stacked in a way that felt deliberate. I wouldn't have noticed them if the sunlight hadn't caught the edge of a polished rock at the top. I crouched down, hesitating before reaching out to touch it. It felt cold, even in the warmth of the morning sun. A chill ran through me, but I forced a laugh. Probably just some kids messing around, I said aloud, trying to convince myself. But who would come all the way out here in the middle of the night to stack stones? The day passed uneventfully, but that night, things got weirder. I had just settled into bed when I heard the sound again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the house. My heart thudded in my chest as I strained to listen. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. This was someone or something. I grabbed my phone, my fingers trembling as I flipped on the flashlight and pointed it toward the window. I didn't see anything, but the sound continued, moving closer to the back door. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. Silence. Then a soft tap against the glass. I nearly dropped my phone as I spun toward the sound. Nothing was there, just the darkness pressing against the window pane. My breath came in shallow gasps as I backed away, every nerve in my body screaming at me to leave. But where would I even go? I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting in the living room with every light in the house turned on. By morning, the footsteps were gone, but I found something else. A deep scratch etched into the wood of the back door. 3 long, jagged lines, as if someone, or something, had clawed at it. It was too high to be an animal, too deliberate to be random. I stared at it, my mind racing with explanations. Maybe it was a prank, some bored teenager trying to scare the new guy. But why would they? No one even knew me here. I called Mrs. Grant later that day, asking if she'd seen anyone unusual in the area. Her tone grew quiet. "You didn't go into the woods, did you?" she asked, her voice low and cautious. "No, just walked near the edge," I replied, frowning. She sighed, almost like she'd been expecting this. "Don't go back there. People around here, well, they don't like to talk about it, but things happen in those woods. Strange things." Her words stayed with me long after I hung up. She didn't say much else, but there was something in her tone, something that made me wonder if she knew more than she was letting on. I started locking the doors earlier, keeping my curtains drawn as soon as the sun went down. But even with the house sealed up tight, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was getting closer. And it wasn't just my imagination. I thought locking the doors earlier and avoiding the forest would help. For a couple of nights, it did. The silence in the house felt less threatening, though not completely comforting. I'd catch myself glancing at the windows more often, half expecting to see something, or someone, staring back at me. But nothing happened, and I started to believe that maybe the scratches on the door and those footsteps were just a one-time thing. Until the lights started flickering. It happened the first time during dinner. I just set my plate down and was scrolling through my phone when the overhead bulb dimmed, buzzed, and flickered out for a second before coming back. I frowned, looking up. The bulb wasn't old. I'd replaced it right after moving in. Power surge, I muttered to myself, but the electricity in the house stayed steady. That night, it happened again. This time, the lamp in the living room started flickering, casting odd, shaky shadows across the walls. It made the space feel smaller, like the shadows themselves were inching closer. I turned it off, but even in the dark, I couldn't shake the unease settling deep in my chest. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up to the sound of scratching. My heart sank the moment I heard it, soft but deliberate, like nails dragging slowly across wood. For a moment, I froze, hoping it was just part of a dream, but the sound came again. This time, it was coming from the bedroom window. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I turned toward the window, my throat dry and my hands gripping the blanket tightly. The curtains were drawn, but the faint outline of something moving behind them was unmistakable. I swallowed hard, willing myself to stay calm. "It's nothing," I whispered under my breath, though the trembling in my voice betrayed me. Slowly, I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it toward the window. The scratching stopped. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, staring at the window and listening to the heavy silence that had replaced the sound. Eventually, I convinced myself to lie back down, though I didn't sleep a wink. The next morning, I found muddy smudges on the outside of the glass. Long streaks that almost looked like handprints, but they were too large, the fingers too thin. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to dismiss it. "Maybe some animal brushed against it," I said aloud, trying to sound convincing even though I knew it wasn't true. But then there was the closet. I'd always hated closets. As a kid, I couldn't sleep unless mine was closed tight. Something about the dark, gaping space felt too inviting, like it could swallow you whole if you weren't careful. So when I found the bedroom closet door slightly open that night, I froze. I hadn't touched it. I was sure of that. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the narrow sliver of darkness between the door and the frame. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe I hadn't closed it properly earlier. Maybe the wind had somehow pushed it open. Taking a deep breath, I stepped forward and pulled it shut. "Done," I said firmly, as if saying it out loud would somehow make it true. But as I turned to walk away, I heard it. A faint creak, like the sound of wood shifting under pressure. I whipped around, my heart pounding, and saw the closet door sliding open again, inch by inch until it stopped halfway. "Nope," I muttered, backing out of the room. I grabbed my car keys and headed for the front door. I didn't care that it was the middle of the night or that I didn't have a plan. I just needed to get out of the house, even if it was just for a little while. But when I opened the door, the porch light flickered and went out, plunging the front yard into darkness. And that's when I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the forest. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shadows, maybe a branch swaying in the wind. But no, it was a person, or at least it looked like one. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, half hidden by the trees. I froze, gripping the doorknob so tightly my knuckles turned white. The figure tilted its head, almost like it was studying me. Then, without warning, it stepped back into the shadows and disappeared. I slammed the door shut, bolting it with shaky hands. My breaths came in short gasps as I pressed my back against the door, straining to hear anything. Footsteps, movement, anything. But there was nothing. Just the low hum of the house and the faint rustle of leaves outside. I didn't dare look out the window again. Whatever or whoever I'd seen at the forest's edge was gone now, but the weight of its gaze lingered. My chest tightened as I thought about how long it had been standing there, watching. I made it through the night somehow, curled up on the couch with every light in the house turned on. But the morning didn't bring the comfort I hoped for. The yard looked normal enough when I finally worked up the courage to check. No footprints, No sign that anyone had been there. But then I noticed something strange. The stone pile by the forest's edge had changed. The polished rock on top was gone, replaced by something else, a rusty old key. It sat there, tilted slightly in the sunlight, as if daring me to pick it up. I stayed inside for most of the day, pacing the small house and trying to make sense of everything. The scratches, the lights, the figure. I kept telling myself it was all some elaborate prank. Maybe some locals messing with the new guy. But deep down, I knew better. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the house felt smaller than ever. Every creak and groan of the floorboards made my heart jump. And then there was the cold. It started in the kitchen, a sharp drop in temperature that made my breath puff out invisible clouds. I checked the thermostat, but it was working fine. Still, the cold spread, creeping through the house like an invisible tide. By the time it reached the living room, I could barely feel my fingers. I grabbed a blanket and huddled on the couch, my eyes darting toward the windows every few seconds. That's when I saw it. The lamp in the corner flickered on by itself. I stared at it, too afraid to move. The switch was still in the off position, but the light burned bright, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. I wanted to tell myself it was just an electrical glitch, but then the shadow moved. Not the light, just the shadow. It stretched upward, twisting unnaturally, like it was trying to climb out of the wall. My stomach dropped as I realized it wasn't shaped like anything in the room. It wasn't a shadow of furniture or objects. It was something else. I bolted from the couch, knocking over the coffee table in my rush to get away. My phone fell to the floor, the flashlight flicking on as it landed. I scrambled to grab it, pointing the beam toward the shadow. It disappeared. I didn't waste time. Grabbing my coat and keys, I headed for the car. I didn't care where I went as long as it was far away from the house. But when I stepped outside, the forest felt closer than before, like the trees had inched forward during the night. The key from the stone pile now sat on the front porch, neatly placed where I couldn't ignore it. "Who's doing this?" I shouted, my voice echoing into the stillness. But there was no answer, just that same, oppressive quiet that seemed to swallow everything. As I bent to pick up the key, the porch light flickered again. I froze, glancing toward the treeline. This time, the figure wasn't alone. Two shapes now, both standing perfectly still, their heads tilted at the same unnatural angle. I didn't wait to see what they'd do. I grabbed the key, jumped into the car, and peeled out of the driveway, gravel spraying beneath my tires. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel steady, but I didn't stop until I'd reached town. Sitting in the parking lot of the only diner still open at this hour, I tried to piece everything together. The lights, the shadows, the figures, none of it made sense. But as I stared at the key in my hand, I realized one thing. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over. I sat in the diner's parking lot, gripping the key so tightly it left marks on my palm. My mind raced, replaying the last few days, no, weeks. The lights, the scratches, the figures in the trees. All of it pointed to something, but what? I didn't stay in the car for long. The thought of being alone, even in the middle of town, sent chills down my spine. Inside the diner, I ordered coffee and sat near the counter, where the hum of conversation and clinking plates felt reassuring. The key sat on the table in front of me, its rusted surface glinting under the harsh fluorescent light. I wanted to throw it away, leave it here and forget everything. But something about it wouldn't let me. "What's that?" The waitress, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes, nodded toward the key as she poured me a refill. "Found it near my place," I said, keeping my voice casual. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the coffee pot. "You live out near the forest?" "Yeah," I said, suddenly uneasy. Why? Her expression shifted, just for a moment, like she wanted to say something but thought better of it. "Be careful out there," she said finally, walking away without another word. Her warning replayed in my mind as I drove home. The streets were empty, the town dark except for a few dim streetlights. When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The porch light was already on. I hadn't left it that way. Every instinct screamed at me to back out and leave, but I was tired of running. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to stop. I got out of the car, clutching the key in one hand and my phone in the other, and walked toward the house. The door creaked as I opened it, the sound echoing in the stillness. The lights inside flickered as I stepped in, casting long shadows that seemed to shift and move. My breath came in shallow bursts, my chest tightening with each step. "Is someone here?" My voice broke the silence, shaky and unsure. No answer, just the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of a clock. I moved through the house slowly, checking each room. Everything was where it should be, but the air felt heavier, colder. When I reached the living room, I stopped. The closet door was open again. I didn't remember leaving it like that, but at this point it didn't matter. What mattered was what was inside. There was something standing there. At first, I thought it was just the shadows playing tricks on me. But then it moved, a slow, jerky motion that made my blood run cold. The figure stepped forward, its features obscured by the dim light. It was tall, impossibly so, with limbs that seemed too long, too thin. Its head tilted to the side, just like the figures in the forest. I stumbled back, tripping over the coffee table and landing hard on the floor. The figure didn't make a sound as it moved closer, its shadow stretching across the room like a black stain. My hands scrambled for something, anything, to defend myself. My fingers found the key, and without thinking, I held it up like a shield. The figure stopped. For a moment, everything went still. The air seemed to hum with tension, like the whole house was holding its breath. Then, slowly, the figure raised its hand and pointed. Not at me, but at the back door. My heart pounded as I turned to look. The door was wide open, swinging gently in the wind. When I turned back, the figure was gone. I didn't waste any time. Grabbing the key and my car keys, I ran out the door and into the night. The forest loomed ahead, dark and impenetrable, but I couldn't bring myself to look directly at it. My car wouldn't start. Panic set in as I fumbled with the ignition, my hands trembling so badly I could barely turn the key. The sound of footsteps echoed behind me, slow and deliberate, growing louder with each passing second. I looked up, and there they were, the figures from the forest. This time there were more of them. 5, maybe 6, their long shadows stretching across the yard as they moved closer. The engine finally roared to life, and I peeled out of the driveway, gravel spraying in all directions. My headlights cut through the darkness, but the road ahead seemed endless, the trees pressing in on either side. As I drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The figures were standing in the middle of the road, their heads tilted at that same unnatural angle, watching me disappear into the night. For a moment, I thought I was safe, but then the radio crackled to life, filling the car with static. A voice broke through, low and distorted. "Bring it back." My blood turned to ice. The key. I didn't know what it meant or why they wanted it, but I knew one thing. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I didn't stop driving until the sun broke over the horizon. By the time I reached the next town, my hands were numb from gripping the steering wheel so tightly. I parked at a gas station, turned off the engine, and sat there in silence, staring at the rusted key in the passenger seat. It looked so ordinary, so harmless, but I knew better. My thoughts were a mess, replaying everything that had happened. The lights, the the scratches, the figures, and that voice on the radio. Bring it back. The words echoed in my mind, sending chills down my spine. Bring what back? The key? Was it tied to the figures in the forest? And if it was, why did they want it so badly? I wanted to throw it away, leave it behind, and forget everything. But even as the thought crossed my mind, I felt a deep, gnawing certainty that it wouldn't be that simple. The gas station attendant must have noticed how shaken I looked because he hesitated before handing me my change. "You okay?" he asked, his voice kind but cautious. "Yeah," I lied, forcing a weak smile. "Just tired." He nodded but didn't press further. As I walked back to the car, I felt a faint prickling sensation at the back of my neck. I turned sharply, scanning the empty lot. Nothing was there, but the feeling didn't go away. For the next few days, I stayed in a cheap motel, trying to figure out my next move. The key never left my sight. I kept it on the nightstand, half expecting it to disappear if I looked away. The nightmares started the second night. They weren't like normal dreams. These felt vivid, too real. Shadows stretched across the walls, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. Figures stood at the edge of my vision, watching, waiting. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, gasping for air, and every time, the key would be right there, as if mocking me. On the third night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know the truth. I drove back to the house. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn around, but I couldn't stop. The road felt longer this time, the forest darker. By the time I reached the driveway, the sun had set, casting long shadows over the yard. The porch light was off, but the key in my pocket felt warm, almost as if it were alive. The house was exactly as I'd left it, silent, cold, and waiting. I stepped inside, each creak of the floorboards echoing loudly in the stillness. I don't know what I expected to find, but the moment I stepped into the living room, I knew I wasn't alone. They were there. The figures stood in a half circle, their heads tilted in unison. Their presence was suffocating, the air thick with something I couldn't describe. My chest tightened as I clutched the key, my fingers trembling. One of them stepped forward. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. It raised a long, thin arm and pointed toward the back door. "Bring it back," the voice from the radio whispered, though this time it wasn't coming from anywhere. It was in my head. My legs moved before I could think. I stumbled toward the door, the key burning hot in my hand. The forest loomed ahead, dark and endless, but I didn't hesitate. I ran. Branches clawed at my arms and face as I tore through the trees, the figure's presence pressing in all around me. The key felt heavier with every step, pulling me down, but I didn't stop. When I reached the clearing, I saw it. A small, crumbling stone structure, half buried under moss and dirt. The air around it buzzed with a low, vibrating hum that made my teeth ache. Without thinking, I threw the key into the opening at the top. The buzzing stopped. The air grew still, unnaturally so, and for a moment, everything went silent. Then, slowly, the shadows began to recede. The forest seemed to breathe, its oppressive weight lifting just enough for me to move again. I didn't look back as I ran to my car. It's been months since that night, but I haven't gone back. The house is still there. I haven't been able to bring myself to sell it. Sometimes, late at night, I'll dream of the forest and wake up with the faint scent of moss in the air. I thought leaving would make me feel safe, but it hasn't. Every shadow feels like it's watching me. Every flicker of light makes my heart race. The key is gone, but whatever I disturbed in that forest, it isn't finished with me. Ready for more chills and mysteries? Subscribe and turn on the bell. You never know what story is coming next.